with a very short introduction to present the SIG on capacity building, who is organizing this webinar. Webinar given by Professor Arnold Pears from the KTH Royal Institute of Technology. The goal of this, or the agenda of this presentation is that I will start with the short presentation. Afterwards, Professor Pears will talk to us about the beautiful project he has run some years ago. And afterwards, there will be a Q&A where you can ask all the questions you have about the presentation of Professor Pears. And this Q&A will be chaired by Clara Covesi. You can see Clara will be the timekeeper, and she will also direct the questions to Professor Pears. So I would like to invite everybody to write down in the chat the questions you have for Professor Pears. We will ask them at the end of his presentation, and then you can, if necessary, you can add some information orally. But in principle, we will use the chat box to organize the Q&A. So first of all, I would like to present the SIG who's organizing this webinar. This SIG is focusing on trainers in engineering education. So I mean faculty, staff, student tutors, everybody who's teaching engineering students, because the world is changing, so is engineering education. So it's important that we help the trainers to strengthen their competencies by empowering all the processes who help them to develop these competencies. And we are doing this by establishing a worldwide network, not only in Europe, but also, for example, in Australia. We facilitate meetings and workshops, and of course, we also have contacts with other SIGs because the team of this SIG is by definition transversal. So we collaborate with other SIGs in order to improve or to empower the competencies of our trainers. Until now, we have, as you can see, 9 members who are member of the SIG. When you look at the map, the diversity based on the location of the university is huge. But when you look at the diversity based on gender, we have a problem. We only have 1 male member. So if you feel interested in this special interest group, you can also always contact us and become a member of our SIG. The goal is to be active, of course, in the field and to attend our meetings and to organize in collaboration with the actual members, for example, this webinar and other activities. But also, if you don't want to be active, only want to be informed, that's another possibility. Then we can send you our newsletter and get all the information. So it's my honor to introduce you to Professor Arnold Pears. He's the chair of the Department of Learning in Engineering Sciences at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. Professor Pears holds a professorship in computer sciences at Uppsala University, also in Sweden, and he received his PhD from La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Professor Pears has a very strong interest in teaching and learning, research in computer science and engineering. And today, of course, he will introduce us to the STEPPING project, a project he has coordinated some years ago, aiming to support capacity building in engineering education. And the title of his talk is Enhancing Engineering Teaching by Building a Community of Educators. Professor Pears, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Now I'm, of course, going to try something advanced, so we'll see if this actually works. The idea is to share the presentation as a background instead of to have it as a presentation. And hopefully this works and you will see me on top of my slides. So that would be nice. Yes, I think this is working nicely. Okay, so, well, thank you, Greg, for a very kind introduction. And also for the background. I was interested to notice that you referred to Australia there as part of the network that you're trying to build. And I have a lot of friends and colleagues there, amongst them probably Roger Hadgraft, who I suspect you also know in this community quite well, who I've been working with over the years, also on these types of questions. But I guess the background to today's presentation is something that I have been working on for a very long time, both internally within the universities where I've worked, but then also in this particular context, this SEFI capacity building project nationally, and indeed ultimately it turned out to be internationally, because of course people don't stay where they were when they began their participation in a project like this. So where does the logo and the name come from? So it comes from Swedish, of course. This project came out of a very interesting program that was announced by the Council for Renewal of Higher Education in Sweden in 2003. So in 2003, they announced that they were going to have this call for large-scale engineering and education development centres centred around the disciplines in Swedish universities. And this was going to be a very large budget initiative that was modelled on the subject centres of excellence in the United Kingdom. And so 2003, they make this announcement. 2004, they finally distribute the call just before the summer holiday, with 3 weeks to midsummer and a deadline in the week after midsummer. So in that type of circumstance, in fact, it turned out that only 4 applications came in the first round of applications, and ours was the only centre that was established in the first phase. And it was largely thanks to the fact that we had been thinking about this idea of how to scale up the work that we were doing with our colleagues in Uppsala for a couple of years before. And we had a project proposal that was nearly written. And so we could put some finishing touches on it and send it in. And so we received the first funding period for this project for 3 years, starting in 2004 after the summer. So 2004, 2005, 2006, and a bit into 2007 was the original idea. And then it became, in fact, apparent towards the end of the first phase that this was becoming quite successful. And so the Council for Renewal of Higher Education also both extended the project and put in another couple of million Swedish crowns, which allowed us to continue the initiative all the way through to the end of 2009. Now you can ask yourself the question that we're going to come back to here. What happens to these types of projects when the funding runs out? Because in a sense, they're really dynamic and fun, and everybody's getting together while the money is there, and you can organise events and you have a budget to gather people together, pay for accommodation, pay for travel. And I think we're all familiar with this, that this is the nature of every Erasmus Plus program. It's the nature of nearly every project in which any of us have ever participated. There's a lot of activity, you make a lot of friends, you start to do something systematic, then the project comes to an end, the money runs out, and it sort of just drains out into the sand, and over time it disappears. I would like to say that I think that this particular initiative has had a number of lasting consequences for how engineering and technical education is organised in Sweden, the type of research that has been conducted over time. And I'd like to explain to you why I think I can make that claim. So that's sort of the main thrust of today's talk. And then, of course, I'm of course more than willing to engage in discussion and answer questions afterwards about both how it was organised, what we were trying to achieve, additional reflections on what worked and what didn't work. Is it possible to do something like this again today? Where would we get this type of funding from? I think that's an interesting question that we should ask ourselves, because maybe it's relevant actually on a European scale now to try to gather people together and work out what is it really that is important for all of us to work on together, and what would we like to achieve in terms of future education by doing that. So anyway, so SEFTUS comes by selecting these red words out of this Swedish title, which is called the Nationellt Centrum för Teknikutbildning i Studenternas. And those of you who speak Dutch and German will probably recognize enough words here that are close enough to Dutch or German to have a pretty good idea of what that title means. And it turns out actually it was really hard to translate, because, oh, National Centre, that bit's easy. Technical education, okay, but technique in Sweden doesn't just mean technology education. It means sort of engineering education more broadly in some sense. And then we've translated studenternas sammanhang to be contextually relevant student learning. But really what we're saying was that this technology education should be centered in the experience and the context of the student. It shouldn't be something so much that we impose on students from the outside, but rather that education should respond to what students both think and need and find relevant, in order that they can realize in themselves the type of engineer or the type of technologist that they would like to be. And so this was really, the whole project was based on the idea that if we could better understand where our students wanted to go, then our education would be better at empowering them to get there. So that was the fundamental idea behind it. And then really, if you go beyond that, the goals then turn out to be both student-centric, but then also staff development centric or environmentally centric. So where did the motivation come from? Back when we made this application, I took out the statistics from the Central Statistical Bureau of Sweden regarding the number of students annually that applied to engineering educations. And engineering education in Sweden is a very broad category. So if I slide over here, you can see that data went up to 2007 at the point where we produced this interim report. So what was going on here was that even so-called civilian chronos programs, so things that led to, for instance, a nursing degree or other types of 5-year masters, integrated masters programs in Sweden, the interest in these degrees was declining. And it was declining linearly nearly over a period from 1998 up to 2006. And our conclusion from an analysis of literature was that this decrease in interest in engineering amongst Swedish students was based to a large extent on the fact that we were in most of these educations recruiting less than 20% women. That is, we were not appealing to 50% of the population, or indeed in Sweden, perhaps slightly more than 50% of the population. And if we weren't appealing to women and minorities, that probably meant, through our interpretation of the prevailing research at the time, that these educations weren't seen to be societally relevant. It was very difficult for a student to see, if I invest 5 years of my life in studying engineering, how then will I work in a way that makes society better for everybody? How will I contribute to making the world a better place, to solving environmental challenges, and these questions are equally, if not more important today, as young people also tend now, at least in Sweden, to report that they feel disempowered, that they feel helpless faced by a future of climate change and potentially rising sea levels and so forth and so on, how will they gain agency in this future world? And my argument has been that we need to explain coherently and convincingly to young people that if you want to be making a difference in the future, studying engineering and scientific disciplines is one way to equip yourself to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, thereby gaining agency that helps you to be one of the agents that changes the world for the better. And so, but that message needs to reach out beyond me sitting in a webinar and talking passionately about something I believe. It needs to permeate the educational system, and it needs to be something that our colleagues care about, all of our colleagues in technical disciplines. So how do we do that? So it's not just about the student or persuading the student or telling the student something about how relevant we are. It's actually about changing ourselves and the nature of the university endeavour. And we believed in 2004 that what would help that process was if more of our colleagues were actively engaged in understanding what their students felt that they wanted and needed. And so we embarked on this quite ambitious project of trying to document, and maybe some of you who are listening to me now have read this report that we published at the end of this large research project, which gave an impression, and I'll summarise it in today's presentation anyway, an impression of what engineering students across all of Sweden in 2008 thought about their disciplines, thought were central things within their disciplines, and things that they wanted to work on for the future. And the side effect of conducting that enormous project with over 25 academic staff from 13 universities across the country was that all of these people became a national network. They knew each other really well. They'd worked together in a large-scale project using similar methods and techniques to conduct a piece of joint research that they were all very invested in over a period of more than a year. And those connections lasted long, long beyond the end date of the project itself. In fact, I still meet those people today, and I'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so the idea was that SEFTUS would act to align technology education with the needs of students and society, and thus increase both student motivation and participation and improve learning. And the idea was that we would, through our research and development, promote the development and promote development and innovation in learning environments that would help them to become more personally meaningful, more socially relevant, more interdisciplinary. We believed strongly at the time that interdisciplinarity was fundamental to future engineering. And I think that is largely uncontroversial probably today, but and based on collaboration, both collaboration within students, but also locally and internationally between academics, and to view development of education as a sort of participatory co-design, where the student was a co-design participant, a younger colleague who was helping us to work on education collectively as a joint endeavour. Okay, so the idea then through the remainder of the project was to gather students and academic staff together in a variety of contexts to try to give, to leverage good examples and best practices. I don't like the word best practice too much because I'm not sure there is a best practice. I think there are a lot of good practices. And good practices are quite often contextualized. So lifting one up and putting it somewhere else is not necessarily a good practice there. So that's a personal opinion. We can talk about that later. Anyway, so, but the idea was to collect good examples of what you could do and help to make them more visible, to understand how students learning technology could gain greater impact from how we create inter-subject connections and application-focused challenges, how we integrate societal aspects of engineering more centrally into the curriculum, and particularly to encourage students to learn together, not in isolation, and to become their own community of practice, their own engineering learning community within the context of higher education. And we hoped that the results then would make technology studies more fun and meaningful, that this would lead to better learning, increased motivation, and a broadened recruitment base to education. Now, we have some anecdotal and not so anecdotal evidence to show that in some cases, the degree programs that participated in the large-scale study that I'll describe a little bit later in the talk really did broaden their student recruitment base and become more socially relevant and achieved better learning, but not all. And that depends a lot in my later evaluation on the nature of the university leadership and the power that a program coordinator of an academic program had within the context of the university locally. Universities are even within the scope of one country are not managed in the same way. So what was the ultimate goal of all of this? To build a lasting community, to enhance the capacity for scholarship in engineering education across all of Sweden, with a focus on what we call civilingenjörsexamen, and to conduct this joint project at national scale in order to build research and insight capacity across many, many universities. So the idea was that if you could create critical mass and expertise in these 13 or 14 universities that were participating in this national scale project, then there will be lasting impact in terms of small clusters of disciplinary-based education researchers living in these 13 universities, helping to systematically work into the future together with the people that they'd met in the other universities through the project to generally enhance education nationally. Okay, so who were we? So we're 3 people who applied for this money, and I thought it might be amusing to show you what we looked like then. And I won't, you can see me, but you can look up the others on the web and see what they look like now. But also tell you a little bit about who we were when we applied for the project and where we are now and what we're doing now. So Mats Daniels, my colleague, and we were both working as senior lecturers at Uppsala University together with the 3rd director of the centre, Anders Berglund, who I'll describe in a minute. Mats was our director of undergraduate studies in the Department of IT Engineering, and was heavily involved, as you can see, in professional activities in the IEEE and in the ACM connected to engineering and computing education. Today, he's a full professor in computing education, still in Uppsala, and the research program director of the Computing Education Graduate Research Program in Uppsala, which takes in a couple of PhD students every year, and he is running a large-scale research group there. Me, I was also working there in Uppsala. I wasn't working so much within the department itself. I was working in my collegial engagement in the Board of Studies for Technology and Natural Sciences, more at the faculty level, and was an advisory member in pedagogical questions to the university's academic senate, which was a cross-faculty advisory board to the vice chancellor of the university. I was also very involved, particularly in the IEEE, in engineering education activities, and I've been very involved, and I know quite a number of you who are sitting here today through involvement in the Frontiers in Education conference, for instance, or the other conferences throughout Europe. So who am I today? I'm chairing the Department of Learning and Engineering Sciences, as Greg kindly mentioned in the introduction, and I hold 2 professorships, one in Uppsala and one at KTH, with slightly different profiles. And at KTH, I also have responsibility as head of department there for technology and science teacher education for upper secondary schools and the gymnasium and I also have responsibility for the pedagogical development unit of KTH as a university, thereby providing research-driven staff development training to academics across the entire university. Anders Bylund, still working as senior lecturer in Uppsala, and his interest was in international master's programs particularly, and in the intercultural and international student experience and how that could enrich engineering education in Sweden, help to make it more global. And he's done a lot of work with exchanges and with shared courses with universities in Asia and Australasia. So what were we doing? We began in 2004, and we had a program of activities that stretched from 2004 to 2009. We ran 7 thematic workshops. We ran 3 courses. The first one in 2005 was contracted from Caroline Bailey, top researcher in engineering education research. She was at that point still in Sweden. She then moved to Canada and has been in several prominent positions around the world since we engaged her for that particular course. And that was a week-long, full-time course that was held in Uppsala in 2005. We gathered 25 people, and they participated in a week-long course, 8 hours a day, on future teaching methods and student-inclusive teaching and learning approaches to curriculum development. 2006-07, we ran this huge national research project. So a lot of the people who were in the 2005 course with Caroline Bailey felt that it would be useful to do a bigger piece of work together. And so we made a proposal to the government to run this much larger capacity building project that was based on a 3-stage model that had been previously developed by Professor Sally Fincher at the University of Kent in Canterbury in the UK. And so we hired in Sally Fincher from Kent and also Robin Adams from Purdue in the US to help us to structure a large-scale research endeavour. And then we went out and recruited participants to that endeavour from across the whole country. In 2008, we took the results of that national project, and a number of the participants from one of the smaller universities, or it was at that time a bit smaller, universities, Blekinge Technical University, then contacted us and asked us to create a special development course for their staff locally in their university. So they contracted a team of us to come down and deliver a specialist course that built on top of the experience that their 4 or 5 staff who participated in SteppingStones had. So that was sort of the final, probably the final building block in that funded program. What we did throughout the entire period, though, was try to encourage in each region in Sweden the development of local conferences and workshops, which we could fund from our central funding. So there was a budget for each region to hold a regional workshop and gather people from that region to discuss engineering education research questions and exchange experience. We had a national workshop, this series of 7 national workshops in Uppsala throughout the duration of the project, and we established also local support networks for instance, in the case of Uppsala, this ILNAP, which was based on gathering together the people who were responsible for designing academic programs that focused on workplace skills. So we were very interested in gathering together our colleagues who were interested in developing situated experiences in their project courses that would connect students in their education to experiences that would be relevant to future life in industry. And so we worked quite a lot with that for also a period of 3 years. All right, So what do the courses look like, in case you're curious? So the first one was called the Learning Experience from a Student Perspective. We hired in Caroline Bailey, who was just in the process at that time of moving to Queen's University in Canada. We had participants from KTH, from Uppsala, University of Gothenburg, Mälardalens Högskola, Högskolan i Gävle, and a number of other universities across the country. It was, I think, 15 universities in total. So that was 2 days of course activities and then additional lectures, group exercises and discussions. So in all a full week of activities. It focused on each participant attending the 2-day introductory segment, then conducting a project in their own classroom, and then we had a poster day at the end, where we gathered everybody back together, we ate lunch together, and we wandered around and looked at all the posters that people had prepared around their teaching and learning innovation activities that they'd done locally in their own university. So quite a nice format, and one that actually became a permanent course format in our engineering didactics course at Uppsala University, run in the Faculty of Science and Technology. So this model exists to this day in a course that I initially designed in 2008, but is now being given by one of my colleagues in Uppsala. It builds on exactly this model, that you begin with an intensive block of theory and classroom innovation management practices, and then you help each participant to tailor themselves a particular manageable project they can implement in their own classroom environment, and you connect them to relevant engineering education and disciplinary education research literature. Then they go away with coaching and they perform the project, they analyze the data that they collect, they reflect on what they learned, and they make this poster which they then present at the annual Teaching and Learning Conference of the Faculty of Science and Technology in Uppsala. So a model that we have found very successful. There are many hundreds of academic staff in the Faculty of Science and Technology who've taken that program over the last 10 years. I didn't actually add up the number, but I know that on average, the courses run twice a year, and the average participation has been between 10 and 15 people per offering. And so if we take that, that's about 30 people a year. So that should be somewhere in the order of 250 to 300 people who in the Faculty of Science and Technology who've now had that experience, and I think learned something from it. And it really does appear to have an impact on practice across the faculty. What was SteppingStones? So SteppingStones was a bit different. One of the things that we concluded from the first course is that a course and a small project is good, but one of the things that we wanted to understand was, why is it that engineering education is hard to change in Sweden? What are the things that lie behind this? Is it student conceptions of what engineering should be about? Is it staff conceptions of what engineering should be about? So what we did was we, as I said, hired in Robin Adams from Purdue and Sally Fincher from the University of Kent, Canterbury. We had a theory and framing retreat at Johannesberg's Castle just outside Arlanda. In the beginning of the project in 2006, we then conducted this large-scale joint project that I'm going to describe in the next few slides with 13 universities across Sweden. And we finished off the entire exercise with a 1-week-long data analysis workshop retreat at the Vik Castle in Uppsala. And there, what we did was we gathered everybody. They divided themselves into thematic interest groups based on the section of the large-scale data collection that they were most interested in. And then they all wrote conference papers based on their area of focus. And then we collected all of those papers into a large report that I have a link to at the end of today's presentation. So data collection and the research structure for that particular activity, we took a persistence in engineering survey that had been developed at Purdue. We adapted it to the Swedish context and we translated it into Swedish. Interesting exercise. There's a lot of things about international instruments that try to gauge why students engage in engineering that are very culturally specific. And some of the language in some of these instruments is actually not easy to translate. So particularly, actually, we struggled with underlying conceptualizations of student motivation that were built into the persistence in engineering survey instrument. When we started out, it all looked pretty straightforward. This is a well-validated instrument. It had been used in America and the UK extensively. And then we started to look at the items when they were translated into Swedish and realized there's an underlying conceptualization throughout this entire instrument that academic education at universities is very high cost and high risk economically for your family. So both of them applied previously in educational environments where students pay for higher education. Sweden, higher education is free. It's if you get in, you don't pay anything. You can, of course, borrow money for your living expenses from the government, and you have to pay that back eventually. But there are no tuition fees. And so it turns out that Swedish students' answers to the pilot of this survey instrument were very different from the ones that were received in the US, because the economic impact of failing a course for your family was not a factor that a Swedish student ever thought about. And so a lot of the items were irrelevant. So that's, that's an aside really, but be wary when you adapt these types of surveys if you're going to try and imitate this type of setup. So we took that survey, that was proved to be a big challenge. Then we had an exercise where we asked students to draw concept maps based on predefined lists of engineering terms. We did a critical incident interview, and we did that with undergraduate students, graduating students, and graduated students and staff. And we also coupled that to a photo elicitation exercise where we asked people to reflect on where engineering was in 3 photographs. So I'll give you a bit of context about that as well. So, and then finally we rounded off the whole of this with this enhancing teaching in computer science course, which was tailored to the needs of the Technical University. And we ran that between February 2008 and March 2009, and it was a series of seminars, lectures, projects, and other dissemination activities. So, but what I really want to talk about was this big project. But before I do that, I'll just give you a quick overview of the workshops that we conducted. So in parallel with this big national project that we're working on, we also had an ongoing series of dissemination workshops. And they focused on different themes. So starting in 2004 with our interest in collaboration and social relevance, we ran our first workshop there in December of 2004. We then had a workshop on assessment practices and what teaching and assessing can be about and how that can influence people's attitudes to engineering. We looked at cross-disciplinarity towards the end of the same year. Beginning of the following year, we looked at perspectives on the use of technology. All of these workshops were based around the idea that there were a number of invited inspirational speakers, and then that the participants each could send in proposals, and we selected a program that we felt was diverse and motivating to the participants. And then towards the end of the series, we shifted focus more towards how are we going to take what we've learned, disseminate it, connect it to ideas of future engineering education in terms of engineering identity and the relevance of engineering for society, And then finally, summing the whole thing up with a workshop that talked about educational reformation. What do we do to reform engineering education in Sweden? And how might we go about that long term after this project shut down? So, okay. So, but then one of the things that I have been asked to talk about today is capacity. Okay, so the idea here was to build capacity primarily through interaction with our colleagues. And as I said, we collected a whole bunch of data. So if you look at this in the end, we ended up with sites B to I here. So we had data collection from 8 universities above a certain scale. We collected over 500 surveys. We collected 115 concept maps. We interviewed 115 people. And we then had demographics of who we had collected those interviews and concept maps from. So we had first year students, we had graduating students, we had alumni, and we had academic staff. Alumni, as you can see, were pretty hard to get a hold of. Academic staff, we could get a hold of. They were our colleagues. Okay, so the survey, again, adapted from the Persistence in Engineering survey. You can go and have a look at it at the University of Washington. They have I think the validated version of it now. Concept map, we produced a list of engineering terms and we asked people to relate them to one another. We did the data capture for that using a tool that I had developed, which used an early version of what you would perhaps be most familiar with, technology LiveScribe, where you can record the sequence of pen strokes as somebody writes something on a piece of paper and replay it as an animation. So we used that because we wanted to get sequential or sequence-based information about which terms did they take up first, and then how did they relate them to each other. So not just the final picture of how they drew this concept map, but also the manner in which it was built up. We asked people to reflect on a critical incident. So the stimulating question was, in a few words, what would you say that real engineering is? Whatever real engineering is. And I think that turned out to be a very good question. And then we asked them, well, can you give us some examples of engineering then in the real world? And so then if they were, so, well, I mean, what do you mean by world? Then we asked them to encouraged them to interpret that and to describe to us what their interpretation was. In what is your definition of what the world is where engineering is applied? And then we asked them also then to describe an experience. And then we asked them a whole bunch of questions about the nature of that experience and how it summarized for them what engineering was about and why it was important to them. So that gave a very rich type of interview data that we could analyze. We did a photo elicitation exercise in conjunction with the interview, and we collected reactions to 3 images that I'll show you in a minute. And asked them questions in these 4 themes: your association of the image with engineering. After talking about the image itself, what do you think engineering is? Did your perception change? And is there something that you think about now that you connect to the picture, a specific time or issue in your engineering career or life that has changed your view of what engineering is? What do we choose for pictures? That's picture 1. And these are chosen to provoke. Picture 2. Interestingly, some people said there was no engineering in that picture. So, and then we did an analysis of all of this. So based on all of that data, we took and conducted 5 different studies. And study A looked at a subset of the constructs in the survey and was institution and disciplinary focused. Study B looked at the participant experience and gender and used primarily the concept maps in the explanogram format and analysed that. We had a second study that looked at the participant experience primarily using the survey, the critical incident interview, and the photo elicitation. And then one that only looked at the photo elicitation interview. And finally, focusing purely on gender, we looked at the concept map debrief and the survey data to try to work out whether there were gender differences in student perceptions and staff perceptions of engineering. So you can go read the report if you want to know what came out of all of these studies. I'll summarize a few major outcomes, but I think for the purposes of today's seminar, what's interesting about this is that 13 academics plus a couple of colleagues in each institution collected all of this data themselves. And then they gathered together as a big community in a controlled or in an isolated place, in a setting where they were working intensively together 8 or more hours a day for a whole week. And this was a huge investment of people's time. But once they had invested themselves in collecting this data and then in analysing it, not only had they got the results of the study itself, which was perhaps not as interesting in some ways as we might have hoped, but they had methods and they had experience of having worked with these types of questions intensively on large scale with expert external support. And this then empowered many research groups around the country. Smaller groups of 2 or 3 people who, following this initiative, applied for funding, employed a PhD student, and after several iterations, now today are well-established research groups. So I think the main outcome here was not the result, the report itself. It was giving people the methods and the confidence and the fact that they had a community to communicate to that meant that this was actually a valid discipline to pursue a career in academia in Sweden, which it hadn't really been before we got this money and before we started these big projects that raised the visibility of this as a valid research direction for young academic staff. And a number of those young academic staff who participated in this particular exercise are now professors or associate professors leading their own research groups. Now, how much this contributed to their success, I will never know. But I would like to believe, when I meet them now and I talk to them in other contexts, when they invite me to examine their PhD students or to participate in committees, very often they remember this event, and quite often they mention that they learned things. So I think, I can't prove it, but anecdotally, I think a lot of people remember this enterprise and the impact it had on them, both short and long term. So what did we get out of this? We got out of this an image, a snapshot at the time of what students' experience of engineering was in terms of how the education was structured, its characteristics and goals, their motivations and perceptions. And of course, there's much more to read in the report and you can download it. And of course, I will send Greg my slides. So please become a sort of public document. So we could look at some of these results, but it turned out that most Swedish students actually differ from their international counterparts most of them are quite committed to engineering. There's quite a high perception of confidence and self-efficacy in the Swedish student population in regard to most factors that are associated with the assessment of competence in engineering and things that people think are important to being a good engineer. And what's interesting is that they also rate highly things that quite often are not rated so highly: leadership ability, public speaking ability, ability to perform in teams, critical thinking skills, not just mathematics, direct technical skills. So even back in 2007-8, there was an awareness in the Swedish population that it was not just about being technically excellent. No surprises, perhaps, so much in this, but we were a little bit surprised when it turned out that the majority of people studying engineering, 2/3 of them, didn't have family members who were practicing engineers. So that was something we thought was interesting. But most of them had friends, or half of them approximately. And then it turns out that actually very few people in the student population had a previous exposure to engineering as a discipline before they commenced their studies. So again, it might be interesting to do this in a European context, in different national contexts, try to understand if there are differences in student populations across Europe. So this is the sort of things that we looked at. I won't go into it in detail. I'll send you all the slides. You can read the report because I'm sort of getting close to the end of my time. That's what a concept map looked like. So you can sort of see approximately what sort of terms we had and how they were connected together by that particular individual. All right, so I won't do that one. Did we have any gender differences that came out of that? Turns out that there's nothing much very surprising in the Swedish context there. Perhaps the most surprising thing is that our male students rated communication as a skill more highly than female students. It usually is the opposite in international literature. There was no difference in terms of the statement, technology plays an important role in society. And I think that that is a strong reflection of Swedish culture, actually, that it's strongly embedded in the Swedish ethos that technology is something that is important to societal empowerment in the future. So with that said, what did we learn all in all, and summing up so that we can have a discussion? So the big national project explored student experiences and staff experiences of engineering. We did concept map analysis of central terms. We looked at gender and engineering. And as I said before, we have the full report. What did we learn all in all? We spent a lot of money. We spent about 8.5 million Swedish crowns over a period of 5 years. So that's 1.8 million Swedish crowns a year, 180,000 euros. So it's not a huge amount of money, even if the total budget for the entire project seems significant. And I'll answer the question about how do we motivate people in a minute. A lot of what got people involved was the fact that we were organising structured workshops and that participation, travel to them and accommodation was free. So we paid for you to travel to the workshops, we paid for your catering for your hotel room. And that lowered the threshold for a lot of people who perhaps would have had difficulty getting travel money to go to a local workshop from their departmental heads. Where else did we spend the money? Most of the rest of the money was actually spent in the big national project. We really invested heavily in that because we felt that increasing community and in improving the research capacity in engineering education across the disciplines in Sweden was a priority. And as I said, I would say that that paid off. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I think a sense of lasting community. Even today, when I meet people, they reminisce about their participation in these events and have key takeaways that they both remember and relate. So, with that said, perhaps I will stop sharing. And depending on your screen view, you might see me slightly better. So, Clara, did you want to prioritize some of these questions that are coming in the chat? And thank you for listening to me, by the way.
Thank you very much for this very engaging and interesting presentation. For the question, I think that you have answered to the question of greed. That was the first question about motivation. I would like to ask second question related to this question. It's about, I was really impressed. It's about the project number of project members. How to coordinate a project with so many different kind of members at the local and international level. Could you give some feedbacks about this, or experience, or even some recommendation learned from this experience?
So a reflection would be that you do need some professional coordination. So we had a project coordinator who was working 2 days a week to help us to organise accommodation, travel, events, catering, logistics. But then actually a lot of it was stuff that a person like that can't do. Reaching out to colleagues, giving them technical support in data collection, answering questions about unsureness in terms of research methodology or application of some method to the analysis of the data. So in fact, Mats particularly and I were working nearly half time with this project over a period of the first 3 years, and then 20% each in the last 2 years. So yeah, I think it requires an investment, of course, of time, because to coordinate, and it was, I guess the other thing is to be very clear also about your ethical approvals and to have done all of the right paperwork right at the start. We were very disciplined with that, and we collected all of that information, archived it. And then I think, the world's become a simpler place. When we were doing this, cloud solutions were not nearly as prevalent and as widespread use. So it was quite tough to coordinate and centralize and secure the data collection. Partly because data collection, of course, requires you to protect the data from manipulation by external sources. So, and also to limit accessibility to it. And we need to do that in a central location. And that ended up meaning that we actually needed to encrypt information and send it on by DVD or CD by certified post between different parts of Sweden, for instance, to get data collection happening. Nowadays, we would just put it all into a OneDrive repository and it would be easier to track. But setting up systematically what you expect from every researcher and providing them with support and reminders is important, because a lot of the people who were participating in this were not being paid from the project. They were either working on this out of their own personal enthusiasm, or they were working with some relatively small amount of time that had been made available by their head of department. And I think, as we're all familiar with, a lot of this type of research people in our profession are doing in their spare time. It's sort of on top of your normal academic work. So
thank you. Oh, sorry.
no, that's all good. Go for it.
Thank you for this answer, and also the indication for future project. I think it will be useful. A question of Cecilia Haskins. Cecilia, could you put on your camera to? Cecilia, could you hear me? Oh, no, unfortunately not. So Cecilia asked about asked the two questions. Did the concept map lead? Oh, she's oh, okay, it's perfect. Cecilia, could you repeat your question that was put on the or develop your question, precise your question?
Yeah, actually, thank you, Arnold, for your very interesting session this morning. I actually have three questions. The first one was related to your concept maps. Did you go any further with them in terms of developing any kind of a taxonomy regarding systems engineering education?
If you look at the long report, yeah, one of the groups, actually, unfortunately, I can't answer that question in as much detail as I would like, because I wasn't personally in the group that did that analysis. But they did frequency analyses, and then they did sequential analyses, trying to identify which concepts leapt to mind first, and then how were they associated with other concepts. So in some sense, what was in the immediate focal awareness of the student as an engineering concept, and then what other stuff did they tack on around the outside of that. And then, of course, what was also really interesting with being able to replay them was you could see at some point in this that they'd realized that, oh, there's a connection between that and that, but I hadn't really thought about that. And then they start to draw stuff that goes all around the diagram. And some of that, I think the team found extremely interesting, because it showed, or they interpreted it to be that showed some type of meta reflection. Once you had the original map, then you started to think more deeply about, do I really understand what engineering is about? And you see new connections that you didn't see in the beginning. So, but I think they found it also extremely difficult to analyze. It becomes, once you include a time sequence as well, actually the complexity in terms of analysis becomes very high. And I don't actually, well, okay, probably now that's just my ignorance actually. I'm not aware of any good research methodologies for analyzing that type of temporal thought development. If you are, I'd be glad to talk about it sometime.
I'm going to look forward to reading the larger report. My second question, you kind of answered my second question, but my third question was also, are you aware of whether this excellent initiative of yours has actually resulted in any curriculum changes across either partners or others who are aware of this work?
A little bit hard to track. Certainly, the project had very significant impact in my own university. But then that shouldn't be surprising, because the project participants were sitting in key positions, and we were highly motivated to use the results. So we restructured, for instance, the engineering program in IT engineering. We introduced and strengthened a series of international challenge-driven, problem-based learning project courses that ran throughout the degree. So you had a simpler experience in the beginning, and then you had a very complex experience with multiple international partners towards the end of your education. And so we did a lot to strengthen the societal relevance of these programs. We also worked a lot with the program of Systems and Technology in Society, which is a 5-year engineering program in Uppsala. And of course, there was very strong interest in what comes out of this type of research, and how could we use it to change education to produce future generation engineers with different competence profiles, perhaps, than the technical ones. But I mean, in a way, you can still be depressed, right? Engineering education has not changed. I've been working in this area for 30 years. And I think probably nearly all of us, if we reflect back on this, we're all passionate. We've all changed enormous amounts of stuff in our own local environment, or in our own courses, or in our own specific program. I actually read an interesting thesis a couple of years ago written by one of our recent graduates, but a very experienced colleague who many of you will know, Christina Edström at KTH, who's been very influential in the CDIO movement. Have a read of her thesis. She has this, she's developed this theory of, what does she call it now? It's called I can't remember now. But anyway, she has this idea of that there is a sort of gravity in academic educational settings that draws curriculum back to a sort of base state, and that anything that is innovation requires an enormous energy input into the system. And then over time, there's a sort of entropic effect that draws everything back to some type of base conception of what engineering teaching is about. I think it's an interesting model because of course change is only sustainable when it's truly embedded and it's no longer dependent on large scale external energy input. But we need to ask ourselves, how does such a change take place actually? Because most innovation requires a significant amount of additional energy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I know there's other questions waiting, so I'll backtrack.
No worries. Oh, we've got plenty of time. I can bore you for at least another 40 minutes.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Arnold. Another interesting question, I found it very original, from Australia in the late hours, from Anne Gardner. Anne, can you hear me? If you could ask your question and explain us what is it a good teacher also.
Well, that's something we could be here all night talking about too. But my question, good evening, Arnold, is around expectations. Now, I would not expect or necessarily want all the academics in my faculty to be engineering education researchers, to identify as that as their main research field.
No.
But boy, wouldn't that change things. But even to be good teachers, so even to be aware of what they're doing in their teaching, of being motivated to want to connect with the students and help them understand the material. So
I think it's a great question. Of course, it's a cultural thing as well. I worked at La Trobe University in Melbourne directly after I graduated, and we did a lot of really innovative stuff there in the early 90s through to when I left 98, 99. And I've always felt in the environments where I worked that academics really do care about student learning, most of them, or maybe not so much anymore, but where I worked at the time, it was a strongly teaching focused university, and people generally cared quite a lot about the student, and they also wanted to understand, I think it's self-interest. If I understand how I can make my life easier and better and more rewarding, why would I not be interested in that, right? So if half of my job, or 60% of my job, I don't know how Australian contracts look anymore for lecturers, is to do classroom teaching, wouldn't it be nice if I liked doing it and had fun while I was doing it? instead of seeing it as a nasty chore like doing the dishes. So I think, you know, that was, but is it unrealistic to expect them all to be good teachers? I don't think it is. I think, again, to refer to another, I don't know if you've read Professor John Hayward from Trinity College Dublin's work on teaching as research. He's a good friend of mine, and we've had long conversations about this. And he introduced that initially as a model for technology teachers in the teacher training programs at Trinity College. But I've been using the same ideas a lot at KTH, and nobody's expected to do research, but you might be expected to be a bit inquisitive about stuff that you could do better, and to collect a bit of basic evidence and to use that to reflect about how you might deliver your course more rewardingly next year or in the next offering. I don't think that's too much to ask. I think we ask that of teaching staff anyway, or we would like to ask that of teaching staff anyway. And if they feel that they themselves are getting something out of it, that it's not, I think that's actually the big challenge, that much of this is quite often experienced as an external, quite heavyweight regulatory process, which is about questioning my professionalism and documenting my behaviour, instead of seeing it as being a personal empowerment thing where I'm working to make my own working life easier, more rewarding, and more fun together with my students. I think I found it much easier when I moved to Sweden, because there was a stronger idea that students were an important part of their academic environment, that they had a lot of agency. They were represented in all of the committees in quite large numbers, and their voice really counted. If you wanted to get a change through one of the faculty boards of studies, you got the student representatives on your side, and if they voted as a block, the academic structure couldn't stand up to it. So it was quite interesting. And once they realised that they could have that type of agency, and that you treated them with respect and as a younger colleague, then I think you could do a lot more innovative stuff. But again, to achieve that type of culture in an academic institutions, especially in today's climate, I think with very heavy demands on people to bring in external money, and a lot of it's about, you know, how many citations and did you publish in the right impact journal and so forth. I'm not sure we're winning, actually. The signals coming from university management sometimes, even my own university, I sort of wonder, did you think that through? What you're really interested in is education. Anyway, that was maybe a bit harsh.
No, I don't think it is. But anyway, thanks, Arnold.
Yeah, but
Thanks,
I don't think
Clara.
it's unrealistic. Right.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Arnold, for the answer. And another question from Nursal Efiana. Nursal, are you here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, it's perfect. So if you could ask the question your questions, because there are two questions directly to Professor Pears.
Okay, hi, Professor Arnold. Okay, good evening. Okay, I'm from Malaysia, from UTM, Malaysia. Okay, I have two questions.
I've been there.
Oh, you have been in UTM?
Yes, I've been to UTM. Are you in the Johor Bahru campus?
Oh, Johor Bahru campus. Yes, I'm in Johor Bahru campus, Center for Engineering Education.
Yeah, I used to know your old center director very well.
Prof. Khairia.
And Baha before that.
Yes, okay, nice. Okay, I want to know, did all the participants become practitioners in engineering education after they attended your workshop? And how you motivate them to learn about the pedagogical methods? Because I have experience when we talk about the principles, then I think they will run or try to avoid. So I want to know your experience on that. Thank you, Prof.
Good question. of the people who participated in the big project, the big research project, they were all intrinsically interested in pursuing a future career in that type of research area. So they were characterized by young to mid-career academics who had a strong interest in their discipline, but were considering making a change of career direction to focus more on disciplinary education research and less on in some sense, pure technical research in their own disciplines. So in that regard, a biased sample. But even with that biased sample, I would say less than a third of those people actually ended up with that type of career. So somewhere around 25%. So in total numbers, then about 6 or 7 people ended up making a transition to this as a research area, and then starting and sustaining their own research environments in their local institutions. The remainder of the people were interested in participating largely for this teaching as research sort of idea that I was talking with Cecilia about. That the idea was, from their perspective, that they wanted a few more tools to be able to understand what was going on in their classrooms. They felt that they got some methods out of this, and that they had the opportunity to use them to help to improve their own teaching and their own understanding of what was going on in their teaching and learning settings. And for them, that was enough. And they went back to being teachers in their universities. And I hear from them every now and then, or I bump into them at conferences. They're still interested in educational issues, but it's not their primary career, and it never will be. And I don't think we should expect it to be, actually. I think even for most people who are teaching at universities, the teaching is something that they really care about, but it's not the research area that they pursue. So it's more about how do you empower people to be professionalized in their conduct of their educational practice. It's not about them becoming a researcher, because I think that would be unrealistic and unreasonable. Why should we make life impossible for people? I myself spent 10 years trying to have a technical computer science career in parallel with an engineering education research career. But trying to produce that amount of scholarship in 2 disciplines simultaneously, in conjunction with your technical teaching, leads to a lot of very late nights. And that's not a sustainable career choice for anybody. I think we need to be recognizing that and a bit responsible about what we actually ask our colleagues to do in terms of workload. So that's, I guess that's a long answer to a short question. But the short answer is 20 to 25% of those people went on to do more deep research careers. So Greg, you had also a question, I see hiding here in the chat.
Yes, and already I would like to excuse me, Arnold, because it's a nasty question. It's a question I'm dealing with also, and I haven't solved it yet, but I hope maybe you can give me some solutions. When you have contacted many engineering students during your research, but they were registered already, they were engineering students. So it would be very interesting to look at students who considered to register, but finally did not. And the same is happening because we are focusing on capacity building, the same is happening with the teaching staff. You just told Nurzal that you focused on intrinsically motivated staff. But what about the others? What are their perceptions, motivations, and things like that? I'm sorry for the question.
No, it's a great question, and actually central to everything I do nowadays. So to answer the first question in regard to students, what have I been working on? I'm really interested to understand why it is that or what it is that causes students to choose particular pathways in life, from young people all the way through to university people. One way I'm trying to look at that at the moment is with a PhD student that I have at KTH. We're trying to look at how do technology and natural, well, we're looking particularly because Sweden has this school subject called technology, which has a special place in the curriculum. It's sort of a combination of their design and technology curriculum in the UK, but it's much more focused on technology, technological artifacts, and technological development in the Swedish curriculum. Anyway, with that said, what we've done is we've structured a project where, first of all, we look at how do technology programs portray themselves to others. And so if you look at the types of media sources that students might look at in terms of choosing an education, how do these programs present themselves? What types of rhetoric do they use? We're particularly interested in how they portray themselves in images that they use in their webs and social media. What images do they choose? What are the structural features of those images? Are they inward looking? Are they outward looking and inclusive? Are they technology artifact focused? Are they? So we've done a piece of preliminary research which we published a year or two back, which collected image material from websites from a variety of technical upper secondary schools that are offering this technology profile to upper secondary school students, and we just analysed, how does, and then related it to inclusivity research and gender research results about what may or may not motivate people. The next step in that study is to collect large population samples of high school students who are about to choose. So pre-choice. So our goal now in the spring is to identify 5 schools in the greater Stockholm region and to sample students in year 9 who are about to make the choice. So we're going to sample them, and we're going to present them with image materials and do a stimulated response analysis of positive and negative associations with images. And there's another previous study that we can base this on where they've done something very similar with looking at images that have positive connotations for women and images that have negative connotations. And so we're going to try and set up a similar psychologically based experiment and use this material that we've gathered from the technology schools in contrast to material that we've also gathered from schools that offer humanities, in order to see whether in a student population people associate positively to a greater extent with these images that are outside technology than they associate positively with the images that are associated with technology programs. So that's one way of looking at it that tries to look beyond the people who already made a choice. The other thing that I've worked on that might be interesting is that we couldn't reach students before they had selected something, but we knew that in the IT engineering program in Uppsala, that a fairly large fraction of students changed program within the first year to something else. And so what we did was we did a longitudinal study there, and we picked about half the cohort for distribution. So, and the distribution of those people was based on a pre-screening exercise that everybody did in the cohort. So we asked everybody in the cohort to write a computing biography using a technique that was developed by Maria Knobelsdorff in Germany. And then based on these computer biographies, we selected a representative sample of people across the program who represented different entry points to computing as a disciplinary area. And then we followed them for 3 years, interviewing them every 6 months, asking them what computing was about, what their associations were, how they were proceeding with their studies, what subjects were important, what subjects were less important, what were the important characteristics of a successful student. And we even followed the students who left. And so there we could see a little bit of, so what happened to these students? And why did they think that something that they initially thought was going to be relevant turned out not to be something that they could do, and then chose to leave computing as a discipline and do something else? So there's some limited evidence there. I think more studies of this type need to be done, to be honest. And reaching school students is becoming harder and harder and harder because of the ethical regulatory frameworks. So if I want to do large-scale studies of, well, actually we're just doing one on mathematics self-efficacy at the moment. But the rigmarole associated with collecting data from 14-year-old pupils at schools all over the Stockholm region has been quite considerable in terms of administrative overhead. Thank you, Chris.
You have mentioned about a student-centered view at the beginning of your presentation. The next question is about this. How we could involve students to contribute to teachers' capacity building?
I think the first thing is that you have to invite them to the table. You have to make it possible for them to have a voice. It's tricky because in many educational systems, students are already underprivileged members of society in a sense. There's quite a strong hierarchical relationship between the professor and the student, to the extent where, in some environments, students don't even dare to ask a question because they might risk being seen as stupid. They might risk being criticized in public. They might risk many things. So I think if we really want to hear the student voice, we need to create contexts where hearing the student voice or being a student and making your voice heard is risk-free to some extent, or lower risk. At the same time, we have to also, I think, establish quite a fine balance between, we're very interested in understanding what you think and what you think you need, but you also need to recognize that what you think and what you think you need is not always right. That actually quite often, I think I was quite intrigued by a comment that was made by this top educational researcher in Sweden, Roger Selje, a few years back. I was attending an event where he was featured, and so one common misconception is that learning is fun. Learning is not fun. Anything that, if you're having fun, you're probably not learning anything. And in a way, he sort of was pushing the point, right? But in a sense also, he's right. If you're not a bit stressed, if you're not a bit uncertain, if you're not really putting in an effort, are you learning something? And so part of learning is learning to cope with being uncomfortable or being outside your comfort zone, but also knowing that you're in a supportive environment where people are not persecuting you, they're supporting you. And the goal, but I mean, it is tricky because you can also undermine, as as a professional, you can undermine your position and open yourself up to just wide-scale student criticism. So what I've tried to do is say to my students, well, you know, we are all in this together, but you also have to realize that I'm a senior colleague with 30 years more experience. And sometimes I know more about what's going on than you do at your current point in life. And it's always wise to listen, or it's quite often wise to listen to a mentor and take their point of view seriously. And it will also stand you in good stead in working life in the future, remembering that many of these skills that we're learning at university are skills that we'll carry with us into working life. And working life in many ways is much more arbitrary and difficult to understand than the academic system with its